In this talk, I will try to cover how cyber attacks have evolved and how cyber defense has evolved, and literally the adversarial gaming that goes on. One of the pieces which is central is in a lot of machine learning, we talk about machine learning being a way to estimate something. You don't have the adversarial element to it. Let's take an example of Netflix, say. You are never trying to fool Netflix into believing that you like things you actually don't like. There's no active adversary. Here the situation is different. That'll change some things. Let's start with very, very simple, right at the beginning. What you did have is how you can infect the computer at boot time. Most virus, most of this requires some takeover of control. So simplest thing, if someone can claim your identity, they have everything. They can do everything that you can. The next thing, on a second one, if you can fish and see what, hang on a moment, I cannot see my own slides very well. It's much harder to talk to it then. Okay, much better. No. I will talk to it this way because at least I can, somehow I'm not able to see my own slides. Can you guys see or not very clearly? Good, thank you. It is small. No. When I put it in the presentation mode, I'm not able to see myself. Maybe my display. Just a moment, sorry. That'll, yeah, full button display. I think I need to put it on the mirror display. Does anyone know how to get my display on the Mac? Because I cannot see, I can barely see my own slide here. Sorry about that. All right, we'll do something a little different. Do you mind if I talk from there? I can at least see the slides there. I'll just do it down below. All right, much easier. At least I know what I'm talking about in the slides. I can see my own slides. So the easiest thing, if you can claim the identity, password crackers and things like that, that's the easiest way a hacker can go through, can execute anything that you can. Phishing, spear phishing, if you download an executable and give it permission to run, that will run as well. Drive-by downloads, that's another one. Boot record initial viruses were more for glory, and things like brain virus, cascade, stoned, injecting at boot time. They became more visual with ambulance, walker, some of these viruses, and then more interactive with Happy Birthday Joshi and Casino. Early days, it was all about glory. Actually, before I go to the next slide, anyone wants to venture a guess? What would be an easy way to stop some of this? Simple signatures. You're often trying to inject code to take control much later. Simple signatures would be fine. Automatically, what does the adversary do? Polymorphic. So there's a mutation engine which transforms the file every time, unpacks itself, some of these attacks. If you cannot look at the file, if you cannot see what is going to execute, you cannot stop it. So the universal decryptor, so to speak, for a virus becomes its own unpacking. And post-unpacking, if you can, I cannot hover. No, I can hover. I'm much more powerful than I thought now. Good. So the check mark shows you if you can inject at that point, again, the signatures will match, because the universal decryptor is how the virus unpacks itself. Simple. The attacks against that, timeout attacks. It is very expensive to emulate a virus as it runs. Emulation is always slower than the bare metal. Timeout attacks, can you keep doing a lot of computations? Separate attack, stochastic. Sometimes do something based on random number, don't do at other times. You will get recorded as good, you're not. At this point, the depth in defense is very shallow. It's antivirus, from signatures to algorithmic signatures. Signatures are not simple file hashes. They weren't for a very long time. That's not an accurate belief many people have. Signatures were algorithms, little programs which run, which check on a whole bunch of properties. To emulation, which is looking for properties after decryption. Next level. What the attacker truly needs, sure, it's great to have a process, but if there's a process, you double-click on Task Manager, you see the process named. A smart attacker will name it something to the effect of Apple or Microsoft or Google, so it looks less harmful, but it'll still draw suspicion. A smarter way is to inject into some other program, because what you truly need from an attacker's side is execution. You didn't need a process. The process was just a means to an end. So within a macro, inside either auto-open, auto-exec, file open, file print, there are lots of different places where you can target and put stuff in. The concept virus was accidentally from Microsoft. LaRue was very interesting in that it was stochastic. It was randomizing and degrading the Excel spreadsheet over time. So you would see little changes, and over time, your Excel is close to useless. Nuclear was probably the first one which had more of a hacktivist agenda, basically stop all French nuclear testing in the Pacific. That was the message which would print out between 55th and 59th second of a minute, any minute. There were a few others. This wave continued with lots of different techniques. It continued all the way until Microsoft forced signed macros. Now, even with that, social engineering, you can accept it. You can accept to have macros which are not signed or signed by random folks. Another attack, if someone can steal someone else's certificate, you can impersonate as someone as a reputable entity. Probably the biggest single vector when I look at things and across different technologies is buffer overflows. So in some way, shape, or form, you will get executable code through parameters. So if you looked at the attack, first it was a process, then it was injecting code. Now, can I inject it through a parameter, through an input? So when I talk about buffer overflow, in the input you're expecting 3 bytes, I put 30, take control, overwrite the return pointer, override operands, executable code, can I get things to execute? So overwrite return pointer and stack, simple string copy if it's not checking for the length. Most buffer overflows are right on the right side. You're expecting more, you're expecting fewer, I give you more. So I overwrite the return pointer. Heartbleed was interesting, it's right around here, because it was on the read side. So the claim of length was much less than the actual length. So it read a lot. Most of you have probably heard about Heartbleed, right? Everyone, more or less? Okay. So a lot of the web servers were vulnerable to that. Ways of buffer, so buffer overflow, prevention of buffer overflow, data execution prevention. Then within buffer overflow, you would want to call into some function, some source code somewhere, and ASLR. So you cannot just lay out, you don't know where things are laid out. It's not that simple. The way to go around ASLR to some measure, you make a whole lot of no-op sled, literally like a slide, no-op, 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 no-op. Now, I don't know exactly where my code is. I hit anywhere, it slides to that. So the no-op sled is another way. More recently, we are seeing a lot more return-oriented programming. Do people know about our ROPS? Anyone show of hands? Just a little helps. Okay, a few. So one of the tricks, so what are we trying to do? We are trying to prevent parameters and data from becoming code. That's what we are trying to prevent in here. A different way exists to get return-oriented programming, which is the attacker does not write new code. He gets gadgets which are already existing in your binaries. It's not new code, new binary, not a parameter becoming something else, but you do need some way to take control of the stack pointer. And then you go, okay, this copy, this write, this file open, this file delete, and none of these code snippets were actually written by the attacker. The attacker is just using the stack pointer, frame pointer, base pointer to move around and execute code. So literally within your code, there's so much data, so many instructions. The instructions preceding return become the gadgets or the building blocks for the attacker. On a separate note, the Google Project Aurora, which was attacking where China literally infiltrated some of Google's machines, it was using IE, buffer overflow attacks with dangling pointers. We were focusing on the how of the attack, which is, okay, they will do blah. A different technique is focusing on the what of the attack. So if hypothetically I want to go to that light, I could go straight, I could make random walk in different directions and go there. Similarly, an attacker can do a lot of different things to eventually go there. So the more advanced technique is behavioral engine protection. This is in most of the antivirus semantic has it, I know. So randomization will not work because even then we will see that the final behavior is you have overwritten these registries, you have deleted these files. So if there's a k-step attack and you put n steps for random walk to confuse the antivirus, Square root of n is approximately how far you will be deviated. Square root of n, sometimes you need that many compensatory steps, and then the attacker would go through. However, a behavioral engine typically has to hook in much deeper because it's looking not just at what the file signature is. This is no longer static scan. This is dynamic. While this file is running, the process is running, which registry, what is it doing, system calls, all of that is being tracked. Is this somewhat clear before I move on? If you shake your head from side to side, your neighbor won't notice, I will. So, okay, everyone figured out. This one was an important one. So, on the consequence side, there is an overhead hooking into all of these APIs. People notice some overhead, and we minimize that overhead as much as possible, but there is definitely something. Actually, there's one more for the reputation. I forgot. Signer. So reputation engine pretty much looks at the reputation across many downloads, files, URLs, hosts, IPs, signers, the reputation of that, and that is served up. And oftentimes, on day 0, when we see a file, that acts as a seed, because by association, all of these positive quantities are attesting to the validity of this file or process. It's okay. A differentiated one, the reason I put semantic is because this is one of the places where semantic is a bit more differentiated, is the Mr. Clean. So one type of reputation is host, IP, URL, and file. The other type of reputation is which users have which files, which users have run which processes, which users are visiting which URLs. How does that help? Some of us have good browsing hygiene, some of us have poor browsing hygiene. While we're just more aggressive. Someone never gets infected, someone always gets infected. By correlating that, there is value. So the Markovian or not, let me break it down a little bit. Markovian is when out of n steps to getting there, only the nth step matters. The memory doesn't matter. How you got there doesn't matter. So it's true that only the file, not how it came there, matters. But for zero-day attacks, oftentimes, the file, we do not collectively have the attributes which identify the file as malicious. The spread and the path often acts as a differentiated value. And there, the endpoints, all these endpoints, give us great data. Does the Markovian or not make sense? Should I try to reiterate? Okay, shaking head from side to side, same code. No. In terms of machine learning for cybersecurity, typically you have bagging, boosting, Bayesian networks, of course, decision trees, some ensemble and voting, and neural nets. At a very broad level, bagging is about classifiers coming up in parallel, taking subsets of features. Boosting is a sequential process where there's a classifier on the errors you train, on the errors you train, on the errors you train. So boosting is fundamentally sequential, bagging is more parallel, and neural nets oftentimes is about finding the way to descend on some cost function with a bunch of perceptrons. So here I gave a picture, and this corner, there's inputs, outputs, and a hidden layer which creates a matrix and helps you evaluate things. So neural nets, interestingly, can be evaluated on the server side, of course, because there's a bunch of big matrix multiplications. On the client side, on the agent, you will slow down the processing oftentimes if you have a lot of neural nets. So a lot of decision trees on the agents and most of the machine learning on the back end. So this was one era, actually two. We talked about simple and then macro. Now the automated vector of spread. The worms, the difference between Trojans, virus, and worm, Trojan is often a process. is a process that runs. Either you gave it permission, it spearphished you somehow. Virus modifies an existing process, injects itself, takes control, executes within that process. You won't see something in the task manager, literally like a virus transforms something. Worm is a replication technique. So it does not need human intervention. It does not need you to forward the email. It just propagates because of something which it can use on the other side. I'll give an example. Probably the first one was Morris Worm, which is basically a vulnerability in the finger command, and you cause remote execution, and it can replicate very, very rapidly. So 10% of the internet. This is not a category where you can go with traditional file-based signature. You just don't have time. So similarly for Melissa, which was email, so network finger was literally over wire call. Melissa was over email, was sending to the first 50. Love letter, I think, was to the whole set. And code red, again, attacked the IIS servers with a buffer overflow. But along with the attack, the replication was going and looking for others. Who else can I attack? So the spread is very rampant. What does that do? There's a requirement for intrusion prevention system. There is no file for say, Morris Worm. There is no file to scan. So you have to do something at the network level. Either you'll do the network packet analysis on the network layer or on the host. So either intrusion prevention, firewall, etc. Here, actually firewall won't, unless you stop it, won't do it. Or something on the other end. Similarly for emails, you see a lot of acquisitions around this time on both network and email products, and the start of Snort, Checkpoint, Message Labs, Ironport, whole lot of these. So if I look at the OSI 7-layered stack, the first 4 layers, physical, data link, network, transport, that's what firewall looks at the envelope, decides what to do. The packet inspection going into IPS, IDS, those are the upper layers. And you start to open up. What happens if it's encrypted and SSL? If it's encrypted and SSL, we need SSL termination. We need some way to claim that certificate and do SSL termination at that point to look at things. But SSL termination is not the only encryption. We can do a simple substitution cipher. We can do some encryption and then SSL encrypt. So SSL gets terminated, the packet can still be encrypted. Any thoughts on how you can rapidly tell if, it's not a standard encryption, how can you rapidly tell if this is encrypted stream or not? Or oftentimes the entropy, looking at the entropy is a very good way. So most encryption, good encryption, will try to make it extremely random. If you see very flat, it's probably encrypted, even if it's using English letters. The distribution is unusually flat. In English language, for instance, you will find 12% Aziz, followed by T, followed by, I think, A. So that's a good way to tell if the stream is likely encrypted or not. So the result at this point, you're getting a depth in defense, network intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system, as well as host. Let's walk through. So firewall looks at the packets. Then you got the switch, and if it's in span port, you've got intrusion detection. You're doing deep packet inspection, snort kind of thing. Much of this is hardware regex processors. It's regex processing very fast. The advantage of the network layer, if it's a non-file exploit, you can see it. You can see the full company. The disadvantage of the network layer, you don't have very much time. You have to keep forwarding packets. You cannot do behavior checks. Behavior will finally run on the endpoint. If it's unpacking, you will have very little idea. So typical operations, decompression, encoding, regex processing, etc. So this talks about the rise of this layer on the network side. On email side, the rise, again, with the worms, you saw that. Phishing, more targeted spear phishing, targeted attacks. You can actually detect targeted attacks by the prevalence of email within a company versus others. So is it targeted to that company? and link crawling. So the links that come, you could crawl ahead of time. But if you crawl ahead of time, something like a bit.ly can get replaced. So imagine that the hacker sends the email at 2 a.m. They know you won't open it till 9 a.m. If the email system detects it at 2 a.m., it'll be like, oh, this is pointing to a nice, friendly file web page, no problems. At 9 a.m. or by 8 a.m., that is replaced with something else. So stochastic, because sometimes, okay, for 50%, for the first 5 people, that link will be good. For the next 5, it won't be good, etc. Okay. Oh, I forgot to talk a little about browser hooks. So we talked about how the polymorphic virus, which will encrypt itself, etc. Now, with JavaScript in the browser, you get the same thing. Oftentimes, the virus comes down, it is encrypted, it's going to unpack itself, do all the damage, do a bunch of decrypting, and then finally execute. So for it to work, you need browser hooks, basically. Some hook into the browser so that at the end of this process, it checks through. So we talked about quite a few things. If you looked at the last 2 slides, firewall, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, of course, antivirus, email security. So unified threat management, UTM, as a category around the same time, firewall, network intrusion, gateway-based antivirus, content filtering, who's allowed to visit you, etc., data loss prevention, as well as more recently the regulatory compliance. Are these things going out of your network if you have user data as well? So this is UTM. In general, Fortinet, Checkpoint, they do well-reputed vendors in this space. Next-gen firewall, this may be a bit more my own opinion than even all of Symantec's opinion. So NGFW, I think the key differences is inline deployment. I don't see a lot of difference in technologies between UTM and next-gen firewall. I see a little more app inspection and a little more integration and inline. Those are the things I see. It's become a category, looks very similar from a technology side of things. Some sandboxing capabilities and some of these not super advanced because you simply don't have that much time. Secure proxy is a separate layer, basically can modify traffic. Firewall, IPS, IDS, none of these guys were modifying traffic. Secure proxy can modify traffic. For instance, when you go to the airports, somehow it redirects everything till you accept the connection. That's a secure proxy. Protocol discrimination, because it's not just HTTP. Of course, SSL termination, you cannot do any content analysis without SSL termination. URL categorization, because it's not just about malware, it's about categories. For instance, adult content you may not be allowed to browse at work, etc. Some content types. Inline virus scanning, that is a very fast scan, which is only a static scan, doesn't include a lot of the other things like behavior, reputation, a lot of this. Extracts mail, attachment, executable, payload, and some unified reporting. So this is performance improvement, some categorization, some known malware reputation, etc. on the URL side. It's an effective way as well. So Blue Code, Zscaler, good on this. What we also see around this time is the rise of hardening as a technology. So if you think of malware, anti-malware, that's a blacklisting technology, which is effectively saying, known bad, the rest of the things I'm watching. If I find anomalous behavior, I'll stop it. But it's mostly a blacklist of either known bad files, URLs, etc., as URLs on the host intrusion prevention. And after that, if known bad of behavior. Beyond that, you have hardening, which is more of a whitelist. What is allowed rather than what is not allowed. So it's literally going to do file registry network process. What is allowed, policy creation is the big work. Here, it is true that if you make it restrictive enough, 0 days cannot get through. But it is also true that it is very hard to write that policy set which will allow your employees to work without disruption. So the policy creation work is the important piece. How restrictive, how deep you go, how much you permit, that's the hard part. That's the art of this in this area. I put the cutesy water everywhere, but not a drop to drink, because you've got whole machines, but you get very little tolerance for how much your system, your security systems should consume on that machine. Because users notice things, users are running things to the max, doing dozens of things, so it's non-trivial. Policy management, file creation, file access registry, those are the things. Some reporting, compliance as well, say SOX, HIPAA, all of these become buckets of policies. And these are provided by some out of the box. So we talked about whitelist, which is antivirus, also has a host intrusion prevention. We talked about firewalls ahead of it. We talked about, blacklist, which is the antivirus, whitelist, which is the hardening. Then you get to the data loss prevention. So DLP typically, alongside identity and encryption, will form the info protection block of things. Does some compliance, classifies the content. Not all content is equal. How do you know which content is not equal or more prioritized? Either by users notifying that these are the priority files, or by a rule, a bunch of SSN-looking numbers, or no SSN-looking 9-digit numbers will go out of this company. No 16-digit numbers will ever go out of this company. So you can also do, in the more advanced ones, you can also do partial document. So literally for a full document, no snippet can be taken out very easily. So there's a partial document rolling hash, which is going to look whether there's an attempt to exfiltrate partial documents as well as some image. More things that will probably, we will see over time, more statistical techniques, because there's a difference between blocking and warning. So false positives, when you block, people's tolerance for false positives is rather low because you just stopped something from happening. Warning, you can give up to some number, which may be one or two screens worth of data every day, and then the skill is in ranking the risks. So DLP at this point is all block as well as report. You can report as well. I think over time, the warning of the number content to the text content, the image content, image is often a way to exfiltrate data, because you can now take, alongside your testing tools for front end, you can take snapshots of your screen, and that gets you an image out of the picture. Remote execution. So top vectors, actually, for some period, 2015, you will see a whole lot on Adobe, then Java Security Manager, Sandbox Escape, drive-by downloads, rise of ransomware, and more sophistication in Unpacker. On the other side, browser sandboxing in Chrome and IE, rise of HTML5 to rid ourselves of some of the Adobe issues. Java largely disabled in many browsers, though almost everything that I saw was Java Security Manager Escape. Reputation, sandboxing, behavioral signature, hooks in the browser, ransomware. Actually, on the ransomware one, does anyone want to take a crack at what is the behavior you'll see in ransomware? You may have a lot of code, but what is the behavior you will see on the endpoint? Lots of reads and writes, oftentimes sequential reads in a folder, lots of files being read which they didn't create, and overwriting that file. Perfect. So it's very hard to look at all the code because they can do it in hundreds of ways, but finally, the behavior is very well understood. SQL injection, pretty simple, but at the same time, it's hard to remember it all the time. So imagine a text box where you are supposed to enter your name. So say Joe, and Joe becomes a parameter to the query. So it would become select star from employee where employee ID equals Joe. Instead of that, if someone puts in employee ID is 125 or 1 equals 1, if you do not check for this, this becomes 125 or 1 equals 1, which is always true, which means everyone's data will come out. Did this make sense? Another very useful thing to know, SQL comments, 2 dashes. Again, you can throw in that to drop a section of the query. You have, say, user input and then a bunch of different things. You can just put 2 dashes and the rest of the query becomes a comment. Terminate with take control of the query. You can do a drop table if you're the attacker. On the defense side, if I look at which layer of the database engine is this attacking, this input goes to a mid-tier, goes to the database, mid-tier did not escape it. What ended up happening is that the parser built a parse tree, and really you wanted data for one node, it ended up creating more nodes or changing the parse tree. Did I make sense? Parse tree is fundamentally the one which we attacked. We didn't give Joe, we gave Joe or 1 equals 1, which changed the full execution. With the prepared statement, this parse tree is pre-parsed. So a lot of people do prepared statements in Java and other languages for performance because the parsing you don't incur at runtime. From a security standpoint, it's a lot easier. It's pre-parsed. Cross-site request forgery. So attacker sends an email or web link with some amount to transfer, and you are already logged into the good site. So it picks up your credential and using your faith or whatever, it's finally using your credential to do that exercise. The hacker did not need your credentials. They're just getting you to click and use your credentials to do the same. So now same origin policy, check referrer from browser of user. Null referrer is not good enough because you can bounce it off of an FTP server and make it null. Randomized token in sessions. Cross-site scripting. On a page, say we allow comments to be entered. If a comment is not escaped and can enter code, then every person who visits that website gets that code executing in their browser. On a secondary note, if you can get a reflected attack, that works too. This is a stored attack. So email with web page or link with some parameter, which is much like SQL injection, but basically it's like your input. If the server side will reflect back your input, and an attacker over email providing you a link could get you to provide that input, then email comes in with the code embedded in the link. You clicked, it came back, executed in your browser. So that's the reflected attack. This has impacted quite a few. At some points, this overtook buffer overflow as a primary attack vector. So in terms of malware evolution, it's a lot of work to write all this, to write return-oriented programming. Does every hacker know all of this and do all of this? Not really. A lot of people are building on layers of expertise. So exploit kits. So if you look at malware, find a vulnerability, often a 0-day unpatched vulnerability, or doesn't even have to be a 0-day. Could be patches out, you just haven't patched. Exploit kit, which will leverage that vulnerability, and a payload, which is separate. The payload usually contains how it will replicate. And along with that replication, what will happen here, and many of these attacks require a remote shell and some command and control. So I couldn't put all of it in one line. Within the payload, you'll finally have actually replicator, job executor, and some CNC communication. One interesting thing, somehow the malware finds itself on your machine. Much like you wake up and you want to know where you are, the malware needs to know where it is. So anything looking for its own IP, looking for proxies, looking for external IP, oftentimes is itself a vector, because the malware needs to locate itself, get its bearings, so that it knows which peers to connect to, what to do next. With the number of things that have moved, there's a whole new evolution of testing, readiness, static testing, dynamic testing, the attacks coming much more over the web, OWASP, rise of the OWASP top 10, etc. Open source security. So a good way to attack for a lot of attacks is if a hacker can find some open source vulnerability, like Heartbleed found one. If someone finds an IIS or IE, it's widely prevalent. So config assessment, compliance. Compliance is checking for broad guidelines, and config assessment, are you configured right? For instance, in Heartbleed, it was mostly about the heartbeat message. So if SSL didn't have a keep alive with someone, it would not work, because it leveraged the SSL keep alive, claiming that I've given you, say, 65535 bytes and give you 3. Then 65535 minus 3 is what's going to come back as part of the heartbeat. Okay. So at this point, I was trying to make a single slide. It's depth in defense became DIND, email, network, endpoint. A whole lot more things have come around. You have anti-phishing, which is looking for Hamming distance, which is looking for claims of URLs, and the actual body goes somewhere else, especially if we know the certificate is somewhere. Anti-spam, link following, attachment scanning, reputation, sender, SPF, basically the sender policy framework, which is in the DNS, DMARC, DKIM, a whole lot of technologies. Impersonation prevention, identity provider, SAML, identity broker, single sign-on, so you're not typing everywhere. Multi-factor authentication, I forgot to mention it anywhere on the slide. So non-replayability is actually very important. And the advantage to the hacker in many ways is the fact that whatever you come up with has to be remembered oftentimes. If it's in a password manager, like a LastPass, or Norton has a password manager as well. If one of those, you are in a much better position because it's much harder to crack through. So English language doesn't have actually that many words. Any takers for how many words the English language has approximately? Venture a guess? Pretty good, 100,000, but pretty good. You're in the right order of magnitude. Very cool. I was thinking of getting a box of chocolates and handing out, but you get a virtual chocolate for whatever it counts. Thank you. So 100,000-ish. A lot of times people get very religious or very affectionate to their loving spouse or child or dog. There are lists which you can crack through, password crackers which will go through these. So being unpredictable helps. Multi-factor authentication helps a lot. So semantic VIP, a whole lot of dual security. Anyone who does multi-factor RSA crypto token, they not only need to have your password, they need that token to move forward. So the antivirus at this point is a pretty big thing. It's got, of course, file signatures, behavior, reputation, the Markovian or not, what is the traversal path, anti-phishing, web categories, full-on IPS protection on the host. It's a pretty big thing, as well as web app security, web app firewalls. This one I will skip through because I think we talked about it already. You sent much less, you claim you sent a lot, all this red stuff will come back. Poodle attack, very interesting. This was an actual encryption attack proper. So downgrade SSL to previous versions. Here's a good way to look at it. So the ciphertext, typically on the recipient side, it will have the length of the padding. It'll pad up to your block size. The length of the padding that many times repeated. Otherwise, the other side will give an error. So imagine the length is L. Say L in this case, actually I should have just put 4 because length is clearly 4. It's repeated 4 times. If it's not repeated 4 times, the other side will give an error. So on the attack side, and then this is decrypted. On the attack side, if an attacker can keep changing some of these bits to something else, it'll decrypt to something else. But the moment the attacker touches this bit, say 1, nothing, 2, 3, 4, the moment you touch 5, the other side will say, no, 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 something's off. I was expecting 4 times 4. I'm not seeing 4. It won't tell you that it's not seeing 4, but it will fail. You will get some error. That acts as a clue. The moment there's any place where you get information like this, so they know that they know from the number of bits they've toggled that, okay, this is 4. So finally, this is 4. Okay, let's make this 5. And now we will keep playing until this becomes 5. So 255 times you rotate. Until then, when it's not 5, basically the other side will say error. Once you know it's 5, you make it, basically you know what you entered to make it 5, and now you have 1 byte, which you could decipher. Did it make sense? It's an interesting attack. On a realistic scale, Heartbleed was much, much simpler to exploit than this. This is a lot of work. In 255 attempts, you're likely to get 1 byte. Actually, first you have to do the L to scan and figure out the L. So in terms of danger, risk, lower risk, very interesting. Encryption, I don't see too many breaking stuff like that. On the encryption side, I don't have a slide on Tor, but basically it's a 3-level encryption, and the origin, middle relay, the end relay. The origin knows who's sent but doesn't know what is sent because it's encrypted for the third guy. The middle relay knows who it got something from and where to go, but doesn't know anything about the message. The third guy knows the message, doesn't know who sent it. So it's interesting. It will always be slow because it's triply encrypted, but it gets something done. Breaches are not just from attacks, it's insider theft as well. It is theft of physical computers stolen, so encryption matters. Quick thing here, how things have gone through. So rise of DLP is insider theft, accidental emails from the insiders because someone pressured and tried to get you to send something you didn't know you were not supposed to send, etc. So the attackers, as things have moved, on the network layer, what are the means in which an attacker can go past a network layer? First, encrypted massively. If it's not going to have time to decrypt. Second, you have a back buffer in any network appliance. Say 1,500 packets can be stored. I mingle a bunch of packets, goes past 1,500, starts to go past the back buffer, you'll probably go through. So a few attacks like that. Finally, you land on the endpoint. What are the challenges as it stands? At the endpoint, you have too many technologies. You have a whitelisting technology, which is hardening. You have a blacklisting technology, which is anti-malware. Content classification, which is DLP. EPM, patch management, a whole lot of technologies. How do you run all of them? So on the other side, you have the malware itself becoming much more multi-tier. So it serves the malware. The bots serving email attachment, phishing, watering hole attacks. So the serving layer is really a proxy. That's not the real guys. You have on the back domain generation, much more going on, associating IP with DNS addresses on the fly. It's a much more rapid thing. And a separation now of the control channel from the distribution of the malware. Growth in targeted attacks. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll have time to go over everything. Let's see. I'll just talk about Stuxnet because it's super interesting. So Stuxnet RPC exploit, which would travel from machine to machine. This is in Natanz, Iran. And you have on the right-hand side the air-gapped network, actually. Any Siemens data files IDE it injects into it, replicates to print spoolers in case it shares network drives and USB sticks. So whatever way this moves here on this side, it will get infected. Rootkit on Siemens, which will spin finally, checks for frequency converters, checks for a whole lot of things, and exact number, and finally spins at the resonant frequency. And that set Iran's nuclear program quite a few years back. I don't think we'll have time to talk about this. Shamoon was much simpler. It wiped out a bunch of files. Okay. Malware stays for 243 days within a network. So microsegmentation is rising. Honeypots for deception so that you know where it's coming in. Privilege access management. I'm going a little fast. Okay. If it's too fast, just flag me down. I'll skip some slides. We have 5 more minutes. So CASB, with the extended perimeter of the network, Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, etc., basically ingesting the logs, looking for anomaly, and a position, an inline position to do DLP scanning, user behavior, malicious employee, anything suspicious. These SaaS services are the new extended perimeter for the company. We allow it, and things can leak from there quite easily. Okay, talked about this. Just 1 minute on connected car. So you have a CAN bus. You have a whole lot of things attached to it. What are the techniques that you think might be employed? The repair technician plugs into the OBD port. If the repair technician is hacked, the same techniques that you saw for floppy disks long back will work on the connected cars as well. You start to inject code through that. These different systems on the CAN bus do not authenticate themselves very much, do not do a lot of the security things. So one single system hacked, there's no segmentation. The stereo can talk to the transmission on the CAN bus. One sec. All right, I wanted to end with a little more drama. This was the good, the bad, and the ugly of software. We have made tremendous advances over this last 20 years or so. Hacking has moved from bragging to hacktivists to info stealing to physical damage. On the consumer side, your credit cards aren't currently worth that much. It's only $1 in the underground network. Your health record's probably $65. The techniques remain the same. Assume the identity, buffer overflow, trick the parser, trick the sessions, enter, entrench, move from machine to machine, obtain the targets, exfiltrate, command and control, DGAs. We talked about every one of them. We trade off constantly between false positives and efficacy. A mix of blacklists, whitelists, gray lists, warnings, everything. Hackers attack us on every layer with every new technology. As you've seen, things have clearly moved from one place to another constantly. Our systems, our intelligence, probably needs to be put together much better on the product side. Currently, hackers, the Bayesian of system 1 vulnerability to system 2 and the conditional probability going up, we don't always have, even from the same company sometimes. That is where I believe the future lies for cybersecurity. Much more information exchange, because the hackers are not playing in the clear black and white. They're playing a lot more in the grays, and the interchange of that information. The hows, the what rather than the hows, is where we will focus a lot more. All right. Questions? I have only 1 minute. All right, I'll be around, and if there are questions or anything, you can find me on LinkedIn, and we'll be happy to answer. Thank you.